Good morning, everybody. So today I want to introduce you to the kingdom fungi. So this is the next note in our series of notes on diversity of living things. So we've gone through and talked about kingdom bacteria. We've talked about archaea. We've talked about kingdom protista and plantae. And so now we're ready to talk about kingdom fungi. It used to be that fungi were thought to be closely related to plants, and was kind of grouped in with the plants. But over time, scientists were able to discern some very significant differences between members of kingdom fungi, what are now kingdom fungi, and plants. And so now in fact, when we look at some of the details and characteristics of fungi, we can see that they're actually more closely related to animals. So today I hope to talk to you about some of the differences between plants and fungi. Okay, so create yourself a little T chart here. And I want you to just pause the video for a minute, and I want you to think about, well, what are the differences that you come to mind when you try to differentiate between these two kingdoms. Okay, so hopefully your little mental list will match up with mine reasonably well. Okay, this one might have been hard for you to get to, okay, but if you were to look at a plant cell, as we did, I believe in grade 10, we looked at the onion cells. You would have noticed in those onion cells that there would have only been one nucleus per individual cell. Whereas if you're looking at the cells of a member of kingdom fungi, you'll see that you'll have multiple nuclei in one single cell. So the word that we use for that is multinucleated. Okay, next. So we know plants are autotrophic. Well, what does autotrophic mean? Auto means self. So self-feeding, right? How do plants self-feed? Well, they self-feed by using predominantly the method of photosynthesis. Whereas fungi are heterotrophic. So in other words, the mushroom that you see on a log in the forest is not going to be using the sun in order to make its own food. It's going to be feeding in a different way by consuming other material, and we're going to talk about that today. Okay, plants do have what we consider to be real roots. Think about anytime you've tried to pull out a weed in your garden, right? They will have real roots, whereas fungi are kind of just loosely held in the earth. They don't have what we would consider to be real roots. And there's a name that we give to the type of root-like structure that we will find in a fungus. Okay, so a major difference between plants and fungi are that the cell walls of plants contain a sugar molecule called cellulose, and that's what gives it structure. Whereas the cell walls of fungi contain chitin, and chitin is also a sugar, but it just has a different structural formula. And so that is a major point of differentiation between plants and fungi. Okay, so there we have a list here. I'm thinking probably the major difference that you considered was the difference between, how these organisms will feed. So let's carry on. So how exactly, you're probably thinking, do fungi eat other organisms, right? How do they consume them? So we say that in fungi, the digestion is extracellular. So intra means inside, extra means outside. So extracellular means it's happening outside of their cells. So nutrients, basically, where do you find mushrooms, right? That's when you think of fungi, probably mushrooms are what you think of. So where do you find mushrooms in the forest? Usually on some dead or decomposing material. And that is because that mushroom is actually digesting that plant material that it's living on. Okay, so it's digesting it externally, so outside its body, then absorbing it into its body, right? So, how is this all happening? Well, I'm going to show you a picture here. I think this is probably the easiest way to do this. So if you were to look at a mushroom, and I'm going to look at other examples of fungi as well. Okay, but we're talking about your typical fungus. What you're going to see is you're going to see a bunch of they're root-like structures. Okay, these filaments that exist beneath the earth are called mycelia. Okay, so one mycelium and multiple mycelia. Okay, so the mycelia are going to grow on or below the surface on which it grows. So for instance, this brown material here may be that log that I was talking about. Okay, so collectively, all of this material here is called the mycelium. And then these individual little kind of lines here or little root-like structure are called, each little filament is called a hypha. Okay, so now let's talk about some details around um, a mushroom itself, right? So we would call this structure right here, well, you've probably eaten them. It's called the cap, a mushroom cap. I'm going to try to write this out here with my, oh, I have no idea what I just did there. Let's undo that. Well, I have no idea what just happened there, but I seem to have fixed it. So I want you to label this for yourself. Draw yourself a little mushroom. This right here, we would consider the cap of the mushroom. And you can see all the mycelium kind of inside there as well, right? Next we have the stalk. This would be the stalk of the mushroom, right? And again, we have the mycelium, and then which is made up of individual hypha. So now let's talk about other forms of fungi, other types of fungi. So reproduction, amongst different fungal groups is varies in a huge way. Bread mold is another example of a fungus that we're aware of. They can reproduce asexually, but they'll also form these spores that fuse. Let me just show you a picture here. So if, for instance, we'd been able to, in class, do our bread mold lab, like I was hoping to, what we would eventually see were these sort of like white-like spots. And on those white-like spots, eventually you might end up having these little sort of growths from the surface of the bread, these filaments that contain almost like, not unlike a plant and its pollen, right, that the anther and the filament, it would produce what we call a stolon and a sporangium, and so that sporangium would have all of the spores on it, and those spores would sort of fly off and create other little mold spots. Okay. Now, mushrooms will also release spores from their cap gills. Have you ever looked at the underside of a mushroom? You'll see what look like sort of like these gills, right? And so mushrooms will release spores from the underside of their cap gills, and those will grow into like these little hypha that will actually mate just by simply crossing. I think I have another picture here that I'm just going to show you. Oh, here it is. Beautiful. So let me kind of break this down for you. Basically, the mushroom's gills will produce spores. The spores will be released. I'm going to also see if I can find a video of a forest where the spores are sort of just creating this cloud of spores. So the spores are released. They kind of land on on a decomposing matter or some sort of material that's going to support their growth. And they will actually just start to grow. And so, this might be one spore and this might be the hypha from one spore, this might be one from another. And when they cross, then that's kind of like mating, and that begins to create the mycelium that we see underneath and eventually grows into what we call a fruiting body. So I want you to write that down also in your little diagram of a mushroom, that the part of the mushroom that grows above the ground is called a fruiting body. So again, to recap, spores land, hypha grow, hypha fuse by crossing over with each other. That grows into the mycelium, which eventually results in an emerging fruiting body, which is the mushroom that we see. So yeast is another example of a commonly known fungi, member of kingdom fungi, and they will reproduce asexually. Remember, asexually does not require the fusing of gametes. So we can see here, here's a good picture of, just the budding. And what is budding? Well, it's basically just you get too big, the yeast gets too large to support, whatever its intake and outtakes are. And so it just simply splits. So you see a little bud here. And in this other diagram, you can see, here's the yeast bud, here's another bud, and so on and so forth. So that's how yeast will grow. So if you are growing yeast as like a sourdough starter or something like that, that's what would be happening at the cellular level with your yeast. So again, the way that fungi obtain food is a major point of differentiation between plants and fungi, but they both live in similar habitats a lot of the time. Not all the time, but a lot of the time. Let's look at how they can obtain food. I think when we think of fungi, we think simply of mushrooms, but I want to broaden our understanding of that. So the first is parasitic. So mostly, parasitic, most people think about as, there being a host and one organism living off of the other to the host's detriment, right? So that's what we understand parasitism to be. A good example of that of a fungi that will do that is athlete's foot, right? So the athlete's foot is in fact a member of kingdom fungi that is living off the host's foot and to the host's detriment. Okay, the next is predatory. What? So there are in fact predatory fungi. I'm again going to try to find a video to show you this type of predatory fungi. It's basically these specialized mycelia. Remember the little kind of root-like structures in a fungus that will actually trap little prey. Kind of creepy. Okay, so for example, there are these small little worms called nematodes that can become trapped in the constricting rings of the mycelia, right? So the mycelia almost like sort of grip around these little small worms and strangle them. Okay, so that's one example of a predatory fungus. The next is a mutualistic relationship. So if the feeling is mutual, we say that both parties are kind of agreeing to this or in that situation. So a mutualistic relationship is one where there is a feeding partnership between two or more organisms. So in the case of fungi, we know that fungus, a special type of fungus, will live on the roots of plants, and that will actually help the plant to absorb nutrients. But the fungus also benefits because the sugar that the plant is producing via photosynthesis is going to be able to feed that fungus, right? That's where it's getting its food. So a good example of plants that do this are legumes. Legumes will have little fungi living on their roots, and that will help them to absorb nitrogen from the soil. Okay, and last but not least is what we call a saprobial relationship. This is a new word for us. So what does saprobial mean? It means basically that the organism is feeding off of dead material, dead organisms or waste material. So that's what mushrooms do.